All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. If you're deep in the trenches of postgraduate cultural studies and literature, you know we're always looking to go beyond the surface. Today, we're doing exactly that with early Indian spiritual texts. We're going to uncover the radical social critiques hidden right there in plain sight. We are literally looking at voices that strained against the very architectures built to contain them.
Just look at this verse from the poet Mutta. It instantly jolts us right out of that ethereal, floating spiritualism. Read those lines. From mortar, from pestle, and from my twisted lord. I mean, wow. This isn't some abstract metaphysical meditation, right? This is the visceral, everyday reality of an ancient woman escaping domestic confinement and patriarchal authority. She is celebrating a totally material, intensely personal liberation.
So, to unpack all this complex literary history, here's our roadmap. First, the material roots of early Buddhism. Second, the Therigatha songs of release. Third, the patriarchal limits of the Sangha. Fourth, reading against the grain. And finally, the secular voices of the Sangam poets. Let's get into it. Starting with Part 1, the material roots of early Buddhism.
You know, as cultural studies scholars, we know literature never just emerges in a vacuum. We absolutely have to look at the shifting economic and political ground of 6th century BC Bihar to get this. The dialectical tension here is just striking. On one side, you've got the oppressive metaphysical traditions of Vedic Hinduism, which were strictly tied to monarchies and Brahmin authority. But then, suddenly, they're being challenged by the egalitarian, experience-based philosophies of heterodox sects like Buddhism popping up in these brand new republican territories.
And it's really the specific material conditions of the time that set the stage. We're talking agricultural surplus, flourishing trade, massive urban growth. It was a period of intense doubt, turmoil, and massive intellectual experimentation. Honestly, it was precisely this economic ferment that created the opening for revolutionary ideas, and uniquely, for marginalized women's voices to finally emerge and find a real platform. Moving to Section 2, the Therigatha, Songs of Release. Okay, let's see how this historical breakthrough actually translates into the primary text. The crucial takeaway here is that these songs are not just your standard religious hymns. The Therigatha is the earliest known anthology of women's literature, possibly in the entire world. It's made up of 522 stanzas of pure testimony composed by Theras, or senior Buddhist nuns. These are literally the earliest surviving records of women radically transforming their lives through the Buddhist teachings.
Take a look at Sumangalamata's poem. It is an absolute masterclass in the intersection of class and gender oppression. I mean, she equates her spiritual liberation directly with freedom from kitchen drudgery, the harsh group of hunger, empty cooking pots, and, my favorite part, her unscrupulous man. For her, the spiritual and the intensely material are just inextricably linked.
When we break it down like this, it becomes so clear how the liberatory promise of the ascetic life crossed vast class boundaries. The Sangha offered a way out to basically everyone. You have wealthy noblewomen like Uburi dealing with intense bereavement, powerful courtesans like Amapali escaping the commodification of their beauty, right down to poor peasants and workers like Sumangalamata. It was an unprecedented leveling of the social hierarchy.
Which brings us to Part 3, the patriarchal limits of the Sangha.
Now, as feminist historian Uma Chakravarty points out, we shouldn't romanticize this as some absolute utopian victory. It was heavily contested by institutional reality. Just look at the sequence of Ma Pajapati Gautami's struggle. The Buddha's own foster mother had to literally walk long distances in the dust and heat, facing repeated rejection, until the disciple Ananda finally intervened. Her inclusion into the Sangha wasn't a simple triumph, it was a highly regulated concession, and even then it came with severe strings attached, the 8 weighty laws.
This structural metaphor of the dike is just staggering to analyze as a literature scholar. It reveals a deeply, almost panicked patriarchal ideology. It explicitly frames women's spiritual agency as a dangerous, transgressive flood, like this wild force of nature that absolutely required strict institutional containment to protect the metaphorical property of the doctrine. Because, heaven forbid women actually have unmediated spiritual agency, right?
So, despite the inclusive theology stating men and women were equally capable of attaining nirvana, the reality was different. These structural barriers show us the exact mechanics of ancient patriarchal power at work. It tried to annex women's aspirations completely into its own architecture, legally ensuring that even the absolute most senior female teacher could be subjected to the reproof of a junior male monk.
All right, Part 4,
Reading against the grain.
This brings up a vital methodological question for your own work in cultural studies. How do we critically read texts that actively attempt to resolve or hide these systemic contradictions? Well, to truly understand these women, we have to consciously shift our analytical framework. We can't just swallow the religious rhetoric of testimony, which neatly focuses on epiphonic peace and structural resolution. No, we must actively unearth the gritty historical detail buried in the margins. We have to seek out the material suffering and subordinate resistance that the overarching narrative is desperately trying to smooth over.
I absolutely love how this passage articulates the approach. It argues for the absolute necessity of reading against the grain. It says we must literally strain against that resolution. We constantly have to ask, how did women inflect Buddhism with their own distinct, personal aspirations, even as the larger religious institution was actively trying to contain those very gestures?
The raw grief in Ubiri's poem is a perfect, heartbreaking example of this tension. Her deeply personal material tragedy, the agonizing loss of her specific daughter, Jiva, is just incredibly visceral. But eventually, notice how it gets trimmed by the text into this neat doctrinal resolution about the universal cycle of rebirth, turning her specific pain into a charnel field of innumerable daughters. The personal trauma is captured, and then it's doctrinally repurposed.
And finally, Section 5, Secular Voices, the Sangam Poets. To get a really complete picture of early Indian women's literature, let's step totally outside the religious sphere and look at the secular poetry of the South. Moving to the Sangam age, roughly 100 BC to 250 AD, we encounter a completely different literary architecture. This poetry was strictly categorized into two complementary themes: Akam, meaning inner or romantic, and Puram, meaning outer or martial. And what's amazing is that women composed a significant distinguished portion of these highly formalized secular verses.
Unlike the ascetic escape we saw in the Therigatha, Sangam poetry boldly embraces the world. It celebrates a thriving material culture. We're talking bustling urban markets, trade ships arriving from the Roman Empire, and royal patronage. It's poetry that perfectly captures the rhythm of daily life, even documenting the songs women would sing while laboring in the fields, transplanting seedlings.
So I want to leave you with a thought as we wrap up this explainer. As you continue your own textual analyses in your graduate studies, keep the tensions we explored today front and center. If these ancient texts often act as architectural dikes built to contain women's true historical experiences, what analytical tools must you sharpen to ensure those marginalized voices aren't lost to the flood? It challenges us to constantly, rigorously question whose history is being told, and maybe more importantly, whose history is being contained.